Hello, and welcome to Appleton Engaged. I'm your host, Timber Smith, Special Assistant to the Mayor for Community, Culture, and Belonging.
And I'm Sarah Schneider with Valley Transit.
And Appleton Engaged is a podcast that explores the many people, organizations, and resources that make our community a great place to live, work, and play. So whether you're a longtime resident or just getting to know Appleton, join us as we learn more about our community together.
Timber, this particular topic is probably one of the most common conversations we have in local government. Housing. Housing. So I'm very interested in hearing about our guest today.
I'm very excited about these guests because I have had an encounter with their program a long time ago. And I just think this is so important for people to feel like they have fair access to the housing that is available. This week's guest is Fessahaye Mebrahtu, Program Services Coordinator 2 for the Metropolitan Milwaukee Fair Housing Council, and Sarah Jenkins, Outreach and Education Program Administrator for the Metropolitan Milwaukee Fair Housing Council. Hello, you two. How are we doing today?
Good. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for inviting us.
Hey, thank you for being here with us. I'm very excited about this conversation. But before we go any further, can you please tell us a little something about yourself and your association with Appleton and the surrounding Fox Cities region?
So my name is Sarah Jenkins, and I'm the Program Administrator for the Outreach and Education Program at the Fair Housing Council. I'm actually a new transplant to Wisconsin. I grew up and lived my whole life in Ohio and moved to Wisconsin about 3 years ago. I'm based in the Milwaukee area, but our organization serves the whole state of Wisconsin, so we do travel to other areas of Wisconsin, including Appleton is within our primary service area. So we come out here to do outreach and education, to make sure that housing consumers and providers and advocates are aware of fair housing rights and how to assert their rights if they experience discrimination.
My name is Fessahaye Mebrahtu. I have been in Milwaukee, in Wisconsin, about 30 years. But originally, I'm from Eritrea, East Africa. To be exact, is east of Sudan, north of Ethiopia, by the Red Sea. I have 3 children. The last one is in junior in college. The rest have graduated from college. And I was transplanted from Africa, of course, but I also have made some hops between Chicago and Washington, D.C. Then came to Wisconsin, and I loved Wisconsin. Then eventually, when I got the job with the Fair Housing Council, my assignment was Appleton, and I found it to be very intriguing to work in the Fox Valley areas because in the area of fair housing, there are a lot of people who really care about fair housing services, and especially serving the unhoused and also trying to advocate for more housing.
Well, it is our honor to have you both on Appleton Engaged here today, especially talking about such a important topic. Appleton Engaged listeners, I just want you to know that Sarah has on some very red shoes, and now I know that she's from Ohio. I thought she came in representing Wisconsin, but now I'm going to have to question that altogether. Not quite sure about that, Sarah. We might have to talk about that later. All right.
It's still the Midwest, so.
Still the Midwest,
yes.
Still representing.
Yes.
That's fair. All right. So at this time, could you both please share about the resource?
Sure. So the Fair Housing Council is a private nonprofit civil rights organization, and we provide services to people who have experienced discrimination in their housing. So this means any type of housing consumer, whether you're a renter or you're a homeowner or you're trying to buy a home, if you feel like you have been either turned down for housing or treated differently in your housing because of your race or disability or your sex or national origin or any other protected class, then we can assist people in filing complaints and making sure that their rights are protected.
Really, our goal is also to make sure that nobody is discriminated against, but also create livable neighborhoods so that people are integrated socially, economically, and culturally, so that people feel connected as well as accepted in every sector of the society.
So even though the program is called Milwaukee Fair Housing Council, you serve the entire state. Is that correct?
We do. So the Fair Housing Council is the only private fair housing organization in the state. And as to the best of our knowledge, we are the only organization in the state that is exclusively focused on fair housing. We do have a primary service area, which includes the Fox Cities and the Northeast area, the Madison area, and the Milwaukee area. But as our funding and capacity allows, we do serve other parts of the state as well, because we understand that there is a need, given that we are the only organization that's really focused on this work in the state.
It has been our experience that people have been calling as far as from Superior and other places of the state. So practically we serve the whole state.
And if I'm correct from a prior conversation we've had, there is a location here in the Fox Cities region. So there's a satellite office here locally, right?
Correct. Our office is on College Avenue by the highway, and we rent space there. Mostly I'm the point person that comes more often here. So anybody who wants an appointment with me is welcome.
We do have our main office is in Milwaukee, but we have satellite offices in Appleton as well as in Madison. But anyone can reach us, regardless of where they live in the state.
That's an amazing little fun fact and probably one of our best kept secrets here in the Appleton area. So we're excited to know that you have a satellite office here. How long has that been here? Or even more broadly, how long has this organization existed?
Well, the Fair Housing Council was founded initially in 1977. The satellite office in Northeast Wisconsin, do you know offhand? I think it was the early 2000s.
I believe in 2002 was when the organization was as Fair Housing Center for Northeast was established. I believe the office was closed during COVID and we just reopened it.
So I understand what we hope that, when people are looking for housing, whether they're purchasing a home or trying to rent an apartment, we're hoping that the experience would be a fair experience, but people are human. Things happen. What do the services look like when someone needs your services? What is it exactly that you're able to provide?
Sure. So when somebody experiences discrimination and they reach out to us for help, the first thing that we're going to do is conduct an intake. So we're basically just going to ask questions to try to get a better understanding of somebody's housing situation. From that standpoint, we can conduct an investigation, which is a way that we have of gathering evidence that may help to support or substantiate somebody's discrimination allegation. And then if somebody wants to move forward with filing a complaint, we can help them through that complaint process, whether they want to file an administrative complaint with a government agency or if they want to file a lawsuit, we can kind of help them navigate those different options and understand their rights through that whole process. So we're really there in a way as playing a role of an advocate to help people understand their rights and understand their options and to navigate some of those administrative processes that can be overwhelming if you're trying to navigate them on your own.
So if you are serving people reaching out to you, am I right to assume that those people that are looking for your services are homeowners or renters or people in the community? And how or does the real estate arena play into your world?
Are you referring to like the real estate industry or...
Yeah,
like real estate agents and housing providers? Yeah,
like do you collaborate with real estate agents to prevent discrimination or do you find yourself investigating realtors, if that's an appropriate way to ask the question? Like I'm trying to better understand, who would you work with?
For sure. So I would say when it comes to collaborations and partnerships, we're primarily working with community-based organizations. So that would be service providers, faith-based organizations, government entities like a health and human services department, things of that nature. advocacy organizations, those are more the organizations that we're working with regularly, because those are organizations that are working directly with people who are likely to be experiencing discrimination, right? So we want to make sure that those organizations have the information so that way if they're assisting a client, they can recognize when it's happening and they can refer their clients to us for assistance. In terms of our relationship with the real estate industry, primarily the function that we serve is in providing education, so providing trainings, in some cases free trainings on the law so that they can better understand the law, and hopefully that will aid in compliance with the law. But, it is somewhat complicated because at the end of the day, we do assist in filing complaints against housing providers and real estate agents and lenders and entities in the housing industry. So while we are here in an educational capacity, our role is somewhat more limited because at the end of the day, we are here to advocate for the rights of the people who are experiencing discrimination.
So that made me think. I think someone could listen to this and think, I'm not 100% sure if I am being discriminated against, but it kind of feels that way. Mm-hmm. What might that look like for the listeners?
Well, number one, when people call us for allegation of discrimination, we have to sort it out through our system, and whether it is discrimination, housing discrimination, or it is landlord-tenant relationship that is not working. So we have to make sure that is differentiated first and foremost. And once we determine, then we move to the next level of, Sarah said, investigate and go further where it has to go in terms of assisting the person who is alleged to be discriminated against. For many people, housing discrimination might not be as obvious. It comes in many forms. I would be simply not responding to your calls, not responding to your applications. Could be anything that, especially myself as an immigrant, may not be able to recognize how the system works. And I could be discriminated against and I would not recognize it. Or I could be coming from a refugee camp, so every system that I encounter is a threat to me, so I'm afraid not to ruffle the feathers. So I try to keep it low, and the abuse continues, and I don't know where to turn to, but Fair Housing Council exists for that type of advocacy, and is also when we are doing an education and outreach, that is an empowering to the community, whether it's native-born or immigrant or refugees, because they know about their rights and they have to exercise their rights about housing. And housing is very important because if you do not have housing, then I don't think your survival in the society becomes compromised.
If I could just add to that, Fessahaye brought up the discrimination that an immigrant or a refugee might face. So an example of what discrimination could look like is if a housing provider says, I don't rent to people from particular countries, or if you or one of your family members speaks another language other than English, if your housing provider says, I don't rent to people who don't speak English, or if they refuse to allow you to have an interpreter there while you're discussing the lease agreement, all of those types of things could be examples of discrimination. But as Fessahaye noted, it's often very subtle and very difficult to detect. So it can be things like no one is responding to you. It could be that you're told nothing is available, but you still see the for rent sign out front. For a family with children, it could be being told that, we have to charge you a higher rent, or you can only live on the first floor because you have children. For a person with a disability, oftentimes those folks may need some kind of accommodation or modification to make their housing more accessible, right? So these could be things like installing a ramp or a grab bar, or allowing someone to have a service or emotional support animal even when there's typically a no pet policy, right? All of those things are required by law to allow those things, but a lot of times people find that their housing providers are denying them those requests. So those would all be examples of things if people are running into those kinds of issues, if they're being told those kinds of things, those are reasons to reach out to us for help.
Just to bring my own personal story here, in 1995 when my family and I moved to Milwaukee. I moved a month ahead of them. Then I was looking for an apartment, and I looked around and didn't know how the topography of Milwaukee is. So I got a place in the east side of the city, and I saw the apartment. I agreed to lease it, and I was approved. When I came to lease, signed the lease, I was told for each additional person in the household will pay $100 more. So I walked out. That was a clear discrimination, housing discrimination that I experienced, but I didn't know what my rights were. I just walked out and went somewhere else and rented a couple of $100 more than what I had supposed to rent, and plus distance. So those are the type of discrimination that can happen if you don't know your rights, if you don't know the laws. But at the end of the day, also, the person who is discriminating against others, once they are caught, they lose business, they lose reputation. So it has to be a win-win situation when we are trying to do the right thing. But if you do the wrong thing, you are not gaining anything, you are losing more.
So you're telling me that when you showed up, they tried to charge an extra $100 per person? Wow, that's wrong.
And a lot of people may not realize that familial status, which means having children in your home, is a protected class. So you cannot discriminate on the basis of somebody's familial status, just like you can't discriminate on the basis of race or national origin or disability. So that's one I think that is probably underreported more than other ones, just because it's not an obvious protected class. But I mean, I think one of the things that I was thinking of as Fessahaye was talking too is this kind of feeds into the fact that discrimination overall, housing discrimination overall, is vastly underreported, right? Even though we receive a high volume of complaints, it doesn't nearly come close to representing how often discrimination occurs. Part of that is because, as we've discussed, it's often very subtle, so people may not even know that it's happening. Even in situations where people do suspect that they're being treated unfairly, they may be reluctant to report it, either because they fear retaliation from their housing provider, they may not know their rights or know how to assert their rights. I think particularly right now, considering the housing market that we're in, where there's a shortage of housing, there's not a lot of affordable housing, I think a lot of times people are just in this kind of urgent crisis mode of just needing to find a place to live. So filing a fair housing complaint is understandably not going to be on their priority list, right? They just need to need to get a roof over their head. So I think for a lot of those reasons, we don't see as many complaints as there are actual occurrences of discrimination.
The other rising trend is also discrimination on the basis of disability, especially emotionally supportive animals, where supportive animals are not considered pets. They're supposed to be part of the person's well-being. So we get a lot of complaint about that one. For example, in a place where they says no pets allowed, if you have emotional supportive animal, that's not considered a pet. It should be, and they should not also charge them pet fees, whether it's a security deposit or monthly fee. Unfortunately, this happens and is increasing more and more. The other aspect that we have to look at is also the tenant who might be allowed to have emotional supportive animal. They are also responsible for cleaning up and all those necessary things that to take care after their supportive animals as well. So the responsibility goes on both ways. But however, nobody should be discriminated against because somebody needs an emotional supportive animal.
It's a great example. And Sarah, you made me think of a question with regard to your investigations. How often do you do an investigation and the person didn't even realize they were discriminating? Because I think about the emotional support scenario where a landlord could look at that and just say, that is an animal and it could potentially incur additional costs to me as a landlord. So therefore, passing on the fee innocently under their justification, but then under obviously an investigation, it's determined to be discriminatory. How common is it that landlords just didn't know?
I mean, I think it is fairly common for landlords to not be aware, especially when you're talking about accommodations and modifications for people with disabilities. That is an area where there definitely needs to be more education, because often housing providers are not, when they're denying those requests, they're not aware that they're obligated under the law, say, for example, to allow an emotional support animal, which is part of why we do education and outreach, including trainings for housing providers to try to overcome some of that. But in terms, to answer your question about investigations, whether or not we do an investigation is really dependent on a lot of factors, including do we think this is do we think that this is a case where an investigation is warranted? Like, is this a situation where we could gather evidence or would make the case stronger? I mean, in a scenario where somebody says, I have an emotional support animal and my housing provider denied my request, there's not necessarily any investigation needed in that kind of scenario, right? Because you already have the denial in and of itself is discrimination, right? So there's not really a need to uncover additional information there. But there are certainly situations where maybe somebody, in situations where it's more covert, as we've been discussing, where somebody suspects that it's discriminatory, but we don't have clear evidence, that's where you need to do an investigation in order to uncover that. And we have a tool that we use called testing. And testing is a process where we have trained volunteers called testers who go out into the community and they pose or pretend like they're housing consumers. So these are people that would pretend like they want to rent an apartment or buy a house. But what they're really doing is gathering information to bring back to us so we can compare and see if different people are being treated differently. So in a scenario where, let's say, we suspected discrimination against a family with children, we could have two testers who on paper have the exact same qualifications, right? Same income, same credit, same household size, everything the same. But the only difference would be, in this case, one person has children, one person doesn't. They go out, they inquire about the same apartment. If the person without children is told, well, yes, we have several units available, here's an application, but the person with children is told, I'm sorry, we don't have anything available, we'd have to put you on a wait list. Well, that clearly, demonstrates that discrimination is occurring because two equally qualified people are being told different things. So that's a tool that we use, like I said, when it seems like it's going to be more difficult to uncover discrimination because it's not obvious or overt.
Thanks for that clarification. That's very insightful.
What is a myth or a misunderstanding that people might commonly have about housing discrimination?
I think the myth that I encounter most frequently is people think that discrimination only happens to some people, or that the rights only protect some people, and they don't realize that discrimination can happen to anyone. For example, we've had a few cases recently that have involved families with children living in homes that they owned who experienced discrimination because a child in their home had autism, and they wanted to install a fence to protect their child because one of the symptoms of the child's autism was elopement, meaning that they had a tendency to wander off, which obviously posed a health and safety risk, so they wanted to put up a fence. But they lived in a neighborhood with an HOA, and the HOA did not allow fences typically, which, in general, there's not a problem with that type of policy, but you do have to allow accommodations for people with disabilities. So that's an example. I don't think when you say discrimination, most people don't imagine or don't think in their minds of a family with children living in a home that they own, right? But yes, it happens to those individuals too. It happens to anyone and everyone. We are all members of protected classes. So this can touch any of us and throughout our lifetimes in different ways.
How did each of you get into this industry? Because I'm curious what stories potentially you have to share that inspires your passion. And, maybe it's something like Fessahaye said, you had your own personal experience, which possibly was the gateway to becoming an advocate in this industry. But I'm also thinking maybe there's something even more that helps us understand, like, wow, what a cause, what a passion I hear.
Thank you. Well, sometimes it's a call that we can call that people are passionate about helping others. But at the end of the day is to make our communities better than we find them. And if we can contribute towards that, that's something that we get the satisfaction. Of course, nonprofits don't pay much, but we can survive. But the cause is greater than the pay we get. And at the end of the day, we value the community engagement, the value of human rights and civil rights. And we want everybody to be fulfilled in their lives and attain their goals and dreams, if possible. If we can be tools towards that, then that's what we get the satisfaction and the glory, if I may call it.
I mean, I found my way into fair housing in a very kind of roundabout way. My background is actually in filmmaking, and I, through some series of a random chance, found myself forming a career in fair housing. So I certainly didn't envision myself on this path, 20 years ago. But I think once I started working in nonprofit in general, for me, it was just the idea of doing work that really mattered, that you could really see make a difference, really meant something to me. But specifically with fair housing, once I discovered fair housing, once you understand the importance of housing to a person's overall well-being and stability and ability to thrive and succeed in life, then, making sure that people have access to housing becomes that much more important, because then you're enabling them to have access to other opportunities. So for me, that's where my passion comes from, is really about equity of opportunity more than anything.
So tie that to a real life example. How have you seen that played out in a real life story to fulfill the mission, to your point about once they have housing, you've given them the opportunity to thrive? Do you have examples?
Well, I'm relatively new to fair housing, a couple of years, but I had a couple of cases that was as a caseworker that I was able to pursue and help them gain, what they were looking for. So that in itself is a great satisfaction, because you see people's confidence come back and they feel that though initially they feel insignificant, everything, the odds are against them, but when they see justice is done and you see them empowered and really their self-confidence comes back. When you see that in itself is very important, because at the end of the day, we all need each other and we all need the support that for us to continue and enjoy life or enjoy our apartments that we want. So society should give us the opportunity that's available without discrimination. And that's where the cause becomes more tangible in our lives.
We have a program that we operate, at least right now, just in the Milwaukee area, called Opportunity MKE, where we work with people who receive Section 8 housing choice vouchers. And it's a mobility program, which basically means we help people to move out into high opportunity neighborhoods. So those are neighborhoods with job opportunities and high performing schools and parks and grocery stores and, all of the things that we need to be successful. Unfortunately, the reality is that even though the voucher program was designed to expand housing options for folks, the reality is that a lot of times housing providers refuse to accept vouchers, refuse to rent to voucher holders. So what ends up happening is those individuals and those families have very, very limited housing options, and oftentimes those options are located in high poverty, low opportunity areas. And so this is a program that helps those folks to move out into these high opportunity areas where they can benefit from all of those resources. So I don't have a specific story in mind, but we have plenty of stories from that program of people that we've helped to move out into areas where, now their kids are going to school and doing really well, and they feel safe going out, and riding their bikes in the street and things like that. And they have access to fresh food and all kinds of amenities and benefits that they did not have before.
Well, I'm going to circle back and say, prior to us starting this episode, we had a conversation, and Fessahaye, you said you had a great story for us about working with the refugee population. And Sarah, I believe you said you had a story for us in the Green Bay area, which is near and dear to us.
Yes.
So we're gonna need those stories. So who's gonna start?
Well, I was the director of refugee resettlement in Milwaukee called Pan-African Community Association. And in that 12 years, my organization resettled about 1,000 refugees. As a matter of fact, yesterday, when my former employee, I had a meeting. She's the director of refugee program for Hanan in Milwaukee. And we were discussing, reminiscing about the good old days. And what we found out was we were very intentional in making sure that the refugees are integrated into the society, to be productive members of the society, find housing as much as we can in affordable and safe areas, because, as I said earlier, refugees come from hostile and war zones, so you don't want to put them in an area that's hostile again. So we were very intentional about that, and we made sure that they get all the services. Their children go after school program because they come at an age over school age, but they put them according to their age, not according to their grade level. So we were accelerating that one through after school program. But the positive story is that when you are working with refugees, they are always thinking positive because they are comparing with where they were, and they shoot up so well, and they work hard. And most of my clients are homeowners. Some of them even have duplexes and extra places to rent to others. If there is any American dream believer, it is the immigrant and the refugee. And I have seen it personally in many of my clients. So that's where we want to make sure that housing is critical, but at the same time, you are giving a whole life, a whole future to the people who you help to move forward, and you better the society in that way.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that too, one of the particular challenges that we've discovered through a lot of the connections that Fessahaye has made with other refugee resettlement organizations is refugees oftentimes have trouble meeting the criteria that typically you need to meet to qualify for housing, right? If you think about things like proof of income, background check, credit score, prior rental history. Well, if you just arrived to this country, you don't have any of that, right? So one of the things that we've worked on is trying to help housing providers understand how they can amend their criteria and screening practices to perhaps, for example, allow alternative documents in place of the documents you would normally request. Because in a lot of cases, these are folks who are qualified, right? Who are working with an agency that's helping them to pay rent, that's helping them to find employment, right? So these are people who will make good tenants, who have the ability to pay rent and follow the rules and all of those things. It's just that they're being locked out for these kind of administrative reasons, right? So that's one of the things that has come to our attention, where we've tried to help in our capacity to educate housing providers about those barriers and ways that they may.
I may add also to that, refugees are the most, in terms of background check, are the most investigated people, because once they are told to come to this country, they have to go through a process of at least 2 years of background check, and there should not be, unless there is an income connection that they need to prove how they are going to pay their rent, at least for the. But in terms of who these people are, they have checked again and again by every agency of our government. So that's something that we have to be assured. Let me pivot in terms of what is the bias sometimes we see. As Sarah said, maybe who are these people? They don't have any income, any rental history, and so on and so forth. That's settled within 3 months once they start renting. Same thing when we were placing them in a job. They don't speak the language, but when you put a couple of people in the job, then the employers are asking for more of the same people. But the other bias we see is the voucher receivers. There is a bias that if I rent a voucher per my home to a voucher receiver, they are not going to keep up my house. That is some of the impediment that we run into, though we do not do a drug service. But this also is a myth that is not true, that Section 8 people, they may have a hard time at this time, but they are people who keep up their homes and maintain their homes like anybody else. There is a good housekeeper and there is a bad housekeeper, but we cannot paint them with a broad brush. That's Section 8 vouchers are not good housekeepers. That is something that I would like to make sure that to be addressed. Why? Because it's only Milwaukee and Madison that allows as a source of income Section 8 voucher, but the rest of our cities in Wisconsin do not. It's up to the landlord whether to receive it or reject it.
What Fessahaye is referring to is that rent assistance, which means people who use vouchers or other rent assistance to pay for housing, is only recognized as a protected class in Milwaukee County and Dane County currently. So that means everywhere else across Wisconsin, as of right now, it is not illegal for a housing provider to refuse to rent to someone simply because they use a voucher. So that becomes a tremendous barrier, especially when you're talking about, as we've already discussed, accessing all of the opportunities that come from housing. So as I mentioned, one of our investigative tools that we can use to uncover discriminatory practices is something called testing, which I described. So I wanted to share a story that occurred in Green Bay a few years ago. So this started with somebody who came to us, a client who came to us who was currently living in Milwaukee and wanted to move to Green Bay. And they found an apartment that they were interested in and called the housing provider and inquired. And the housing provider told them, we don't rent to people from Milwaukee, which seemed like an odd policy to have. And so they came to us because that just seemed sort of strange. And we also thought it seemed sort of strange. So we thought, well, I wonder if this is maybe a proxy for something else. So we decided to do some testing based on race. So we had several testers who were white and several testers who were black, all of whom had the same qualifications as far as income and credit and prior rental history. So they were all equally qualified. And they would all say that they were moving from Milwaukee. So when we did the testing, when all of the black testers called to inquire about this apartment in Green Bay, they were told, I'm sorry, we don't rent to people from Milwaukee. When all of the white testers called to inquire about the same apartment, suddenly the apartment was available and they did not mention any policy about not renting to people from Milwaukee. So this obviously showed racial discrimination. I think the reason why this particular case is so important is it, first of all, demonstrates the ways that discrimination can be very subtle, right? They didn't state anything about race. They made it about where somebody was moving from. But also the ways that, especially in our current present-day housing practices, a lot of housing transactions are not happening in person, right? You're applying online. The housing provider may never see the applicant in person, but nevertheless, just based on somebody's name on an application or just based on the sound of somebody's voice over the phone, it may be possible to infer somebody's race or ethnicity or some other aspect of who they are and then use that as a reason to screen someone out, and maybe it's something like, oh, sorry, we don't have any units available right now, or you quote someone a higher price so as to discourage them from living there. Right. So I just think that this kind of exemplifies the ways that discrimination can occur in this day and age and in this housing market.
So you've mentioned several times through this episode about testers. Mm-hmm. And my prior experience with this program is I was asked if I would consider being a tester. So how do people become testers if they want to help the cause?
Yes. Well, anyone who's interested in being a tester should reach out to us. We're always recruiting for testers from all over the state because we do investigations all over the state. So we need people that live everywhere to help with those investigations. But yeah, anyone who's interested, anyone who's over the age of 18 and is interested in doing that, as I said, it basically involves posing or pretending like a housing consumer and providing information to us about a housing transaction that you were involved in, but they can reach out to our office and, we can work with folks who are interested, and we'd be happy to take anyone who's interested in being a tester.
And what's the end result? What happens once you do an investigation? How does the situation end up getting resolved?
It really depends on the type of case. For example, we talked a lot about disability. So let's say it's a situation where a person with a disability is requesting a parking space, right, that's reserved and designated just for them close to the entrance to their apartment. That type of case may be resolved fairly quickly, right? Because if we can refer them to an attorney, the attorney maybe can send a letter to the housing provider complies, and, the case is resolved fairly easily. So the outcome of the case is the person gets their accessible parking space. Other cases that are more complex may take more time investigating. In terms of the complaint process, the outcomes can be different, but it could be things like monetary damages, right? So in a situation like, Fessahaye described a scenario where he was told that he would be charged an extra fee per person, right? So in that type of scenario, if somebody experienced that, you have now experienced a financial loss, right, as a result of discrimination. So you may be entitled to receive compensation or compensatory damages as part of a case. In other situations, there are things put in place to prevent discrimination from happening again. So that could be things like requiring the housing provider to undergo fair housing training or requiring them to update their policies, those types of things. So those are the different options that are available, but it ultimately really depends on the type of case and what the client is seeking as well.
Do you work with a group of attorneys, or because you're obviously very well spoken and very much aware of the law, so I'm curious to know about your background with the law, or just that you have the relationships?
So we don't have attorneys on our staff, so we are not representing clients, but when clients need an attorney as part of their fair housing case, we do have a pool of private cooperating attorneys that we can refer people to.
So cool.
No, I just want to make sure that our services are free of charge. So that's something that anybody who needs a service from us should know.
Good to know.
Also, our services are confidential as well, so folks don't need to be concerned that, their landlord is going to find out that they called us or something like that. We keep all of that information private.
What upcoming events, initiatives, engagement opportunities could you extend to the Appleton Engage listeners so they can get involved or come alongside of you in support of your mission?
So we do have a series of rental management trainings coming up on the calendar, and those are happening all across the state. There will be a session in Appleton that will be posted soon, but we have other sessions all over the state. These trainings are free 2.5-hour trainings on fair housing laws. They are really primarily geared towards housing providers, so people who own or manage rental properties, but also service providers and advocates, people who work with people who may experience discrimination are also welcome to attend those. And those are all posted on our website. Like I said, we have a whole slate of those coming up all over the state over the next few months.
We also do a presentation to the community housing advocates. For example, in the fall, we will be providing a presentation to Fox Valley Technical College for the ESL or English learner, mostly refugees and immigrants. And other events also, we ask nonprofits to host to their staff, sometimes to their client. And we are always accessible in terms of providing services or presentation so that they know more. One final thing is that if there are big events that are having here, normally we can have a table at the resource fair. Also, people interact with us. That's also another aspect of recruiting volunteers. That's a good opportunity for us. Thank you.
All right. So what I hear is if there's an event and you think that this would be useful, you should reach out and ask to come table at our event. And there's recruitment that happens through that aspect also. That seems about appropriate. What else can the community do to be helpful?
I think that, it's not an understatement to say that not only fair housing, but civil rights are really at risk right now. We've seen a lot of policy changes over the past few months that have eroded fair housing and civil rights. We've seen erosion of rights for people who are LGBTQ, or immigrants and refugees, and people who speak other languages. We've seen restrictions in the types of discrimination we can investigate. HUD has been, gutted in terms of their capacity. So there have been a lot of things going on that are really threatening not only our ability, but really fair housing organizations across the country, threatening our ability to continue doing this work. So I think it's important for people to be aware of that. And if this is something you care about, if you care about fair housing in your community, if you care about making sure that everyone has equal access to housing opportunities, that this is something that folks really need to be speaking up, right? And not just at the federal level, but even at the state and local level as well, because as we're seeing federal protections really weaken, I think it's going to be more important than ever that we have local and state protections in place and really strong local and state enforcement of fair housing, because that's going to help fill in the gap where we're going to see very likely inadequate enforcement at the federal level.
And what could that look like in a tangible way? So for somebody in Appleton who wants to come alongside you to support that, where would they align, or how would they get connected?
Yeah, I mean, aside from, as we've discussed, they could volunteer to be a tester, or they could volunteer in some other capacity. If they have organizations that they're affiliated with, so for example, if they are part of a community organization or a faith-based organization or government agency, and they want us to come in and provide presentation or educational materials, we're happy to do that to help spread the word. Also, folks, can be ambassadors for us, right, and to advocate for fair housing. But aside from that, I would say you can also advocate for local legislation as well, right? Fair housing laws do not just exist at the federal level. As I said, they also exist at the state and local level, including the city of Appleton has its own fair housing protections and fair housing ordinances, right? So at those local levels, you can strengthen those protections by, say, for example, adding additional protected classes. You can make sure that there's a strong enforcement mechanism in place, meaning that if discrimination occurs, there's a process for filing a complaint. There's some sort of process for a remedy, right, for discrimination. So those are public policy and advocacy actions that people can take in their own communities. It's also things like, if you see, let's say, a proposal for an affordable housing or multifamily complex in your community, a lot of times you will see public resistance and public opposition to that based on a lot of unfounded notions that that type of housing will bring down property values or raise crime rates or do other kind of harmful things to the community, even though there's absolutely zero evidence to support that. A lot of those myths and stigmas still perpetuate, right? So if you are someone who is supportive of those types of housing opportunities, go to council meetings, go to zoning hearings, voice your public support, send letters to your editor. When these kinds of things are happening, oftentimes it's the opposition that gets to control the narrative and they're the only voice that's being heard. But, elected officials and policymakers need to hear from everyone, particularly people who are supporting these kinds of initiatives.
So what we haven't done yet is talked about how can people contact you if they would like to learn more or get engaged, or if they need the services that you provide.
So the ways to reach out to us are either by calling our statewide intake line, which is 877-647-3247, or by going to our website, which is fairhousingwisconsin.com. And they can reach us through either of those options, and someone will get back to them. We are usually try to get back to people right away. And we do have real humans answering the phone too, which is another a nice kind of benefit, I think, in this day and age, is we have real people answering the phones and helping to guide people through that. If it's not a fair housing issue, we can also provide referrals to other resources as necessary.
Is there any additional information that you would like to share with the Appleton Engaged listener at this time that maybe we didn't ask a question about?
Personally, I do not have a question, but I want to make sure that what I have witnessed in Appleton and the Fox City areas is that there is a lot of community organizations, coalitions that are trying to help the unhoused and the people who are on the marginalized communities. So that is something to be applauded in terms of, and supported, of course. As Sarah said, that some of the funding that they used to get are being challenged these days. So we would ask individuals and foundations to be supportive of this initiatives that is happening in our communities, especially in Appleton and the Fox City areas.
I mean, we didn't really cover the historical context, but I don't know, that's kind of a big topic to say briefly, so I don't know if we want to go down that road or not.
Well, the historical context, why are we here? Why fair housing? Why civil rights? Technically, civil rights should be, or human rights should be a natural given. But sometimes we think we can give and take people's rights. We know our history here. And after the end of slavery, 1866, there was a Civil Rights Act that came out, but it was vetoed in the Congress, which was at that time a majority Republican, override the veto power of the president, and the Civil Rights Act, the 14th Amendment, was enacted. So we are trying to uphold this civil right that has been in evolution and in progressive assertion of human rights and civil rights over the years. So people say that America is an experiment, a democratic process experiment, and we should move forward and look forward as an example of this experiment where every human being is respected and valued as a human being, not somebody to be rejected or dejected.
Yeah, I mean, fair housing rights in particular have been around for decades. And so theoretically, we shouldn't even have to exist, right? At this point, everyone should know the law and be following the law. But unfortunately, discrimination persists. It just kind of changes form over time, right? So as we were talking about it becomes more subtle and more covert as opposed to being more obvious. Or you have forms of discrimination that maybe are not intentional, but you have policies that are going to have a more harmful effect on a particular group of people. So let's say a bank is charging a higher interest rates for a home loan based on the neighborhood where a home is located, right? That may not seem discriminatory, but if the higher interest rates are located in a majority Black neighborhood, for example, well, clearly that has a discriminatory effect. So I think the thing is, you need to think more broadly about how discrimination occurs. And when you think about it from that standpoint, unfortunately, like I said, it would be great if we didn't have to exist, but the work is still necessary because it's still occurring.
Well, you certainly don't do the important work that you do alone. So this is shout-out time. Who would you like to give a shout-out to?
Well, everybody who is engaged in the community for the betterment of our communities. I may quote Dr. Martin Luther King, creating the beloved community. And as our goal should be, everybody should be engaged in creating that environment where everybody is valued. So my shout out is to everybody who has the heart to have a better community in the aspirations of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
I will give a shout out to our president and CEO, Erica Sanders, who has been with the organization for many years, but she's been in the CEO position for, I believe it's been 2 years. But she has really helped to guide our organization through some really difficult times, just in terms of what I referred to earlier about, the challenges that we're seeing to fair housing. And I think that she's really just been like a stable force and a guiding light, because as you said, doing this work is not easy. It's incredibly difficult for those of us that are doing this work day in and day out. And so it's really important to have a strong leader that helps you, even in the midst of chaos, like see where the goalpost is, like what we're aiming for, and that we're not in this alone. I think she does a really good job of, pulling everybody together around those key concepts. So,
Well, at this time, Fessahaye and Sarah, we just want to take a moment on behalf of the Appleton Engage listeners to say thank you. Appleton Engage listeners, we're going to start wrapping up this episode. Thank you for spending time with us. Thank you for giving us your minds and ears. Thank you for caring about another amazing resource in our community, helping to make our community stronger, a better place to live, and one that promotes belonging. I think we can't stress the importance of fair housing. Housing is the foundation for many and the jumping board for your future success. So, that being said, I think you know what I'm going to say now, and that is this. Here at Appleton Engage, we are trying to become the #1 podcast in Northeast Wisconsin, and we can't do that without your help. So, as you listen to this episode, if there are things you wish we would have asked, or you would like us to go about asking the questions in a different way, please feel free to reach out to us. If you are listening and thinking, I want to be a guest, or my organization should be a guest, or I would like to recommend a guest, please feel free to reach out to us. And you can reach us at belonging@appletonwi.gov. Once again, that is belonging@appletonwi.gov. Also, we feel very lucky here in the city of Appleton to have this amazing resource called Appleton Engaged. And I'm a firm believer that the more informed a community is, the tighter niche the community is, the more belonging is promoted within that community. So we believe if there's more eyes and ears that can listen to these episodes, the stronger the community we can be. So what we need help with is called analytics. So as you listen to this episode, take a moment, press the subscribe button if you see one. If you see the opportunity to write a review, do that. And if there's stars, give us 5 of them. These are all things that increase our analytics. And the better our analytics, the more eyes and ears of our community get to learn about this amazing resource known as the Appleton Engaged podcast.
And I would love to requote what Fessahaye said. Everybody who has a heart to have a better community, I do believe that is the Appleton Engaged listener. So until next time, stay thoughtful, stay curious, and stay engaged.